Good morning, everyone. It's Aidan Clifford here, your Microsoft Modern Workplace and Security Manager for PAX 8 APAC for another edition of Modern WorkM8s. So today I'm joined by a special guest, Ian Bennett from Custom 365. So I'd love to introduce him in a moment. It's been a pretty busy week here at PAX 8, particularly from the Microsoft side of things, with Inspire happening last week, digesting all of that information and putting it into some content that hopefully everyone gets to consume and understand all of the changes that are upcoming. It's been very heavy AI focused in the messaging that we've seen over the past week, but I think today's a really good example of how we can have a conversation about some of the fundamentals and core products that have got us to this point. And I think, Ian, from our previous conversations, this has been a core area of where you guys fit in and making sure you get the most out of where Microsoft is today so you can take advantage of what's happening in the future. But I'd love to shoot over to you to introduce yourself and tell the people at home a bit more about Custom 365. And yeah, I'd love to get into a bit of a conversation from there.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a real pleasure. So yeah, obviously Inspire's on. There's loads of news happening there, especially in the Copilot space. But what we're finding is actually most clients, they haven't even done the fundamentals and the basics. So let's get that bit right first before we start jumping the gun into those AI and new tech spaces. It's interesting. So I started Custom 365 a few years ago now, but I've got a background in MSP space. So I've been working in MSP world for about 15 years now. And one thing that really struck me as a bit unusual was the kind of level of conversations we're having with clients in the tech space is usually around the technology and how we implement kind of the best practices from the technical perspective, but very rarely actually impacts and changes how the clients use and utilize their technology and, change their work practices. One of the phrases that I really hate is when I meet people and they say, but this is the way we've always done it. There's always a better way of doing something. So that's where I take real joy, is helping people uncover a better way. And I really love my job because it's once you spark a little bit of creativity from someone and they change one process in their daily routines, it snowballs, and it's kind of like an addiction, and they just keep changing, and they're like, oh, what about this and what about this, and eventually the entire organization's changed. So that's really what I want to help. But from an MSP perspective, we partner with MSPs to try and have these conversations. But ultimately, the fundamentals are when we're replacing hardware and we're replacing infrastructure, actually talking to the clients about why they're making those changes. It's not just because their warranties have expired or, the hardware is due to fail at some point in the future. If we could proactively have change conversations with those clients, then they'll actually have a positive reason for the change instead of just the financial burden of a 5-year churn of the hardware. So that's what my passion, I suppose, is, to help MSPs have those conversations. So that's what I would like to see over the next few years, is those MSPs changing that conversation thread.
Yeah, awesome. And I think you've touched on a couple of really nice areas of kind of changing up that cultural internal conversation of this is the way we've always done it. It's obviously a pretty sort of negative lens that doesn't lend itself to taking advantage of the opportunities of technology from the customer side. But then going through to the MSP side as well, you've also got, if you're dependent largely on refresh cycles or just kind of compelling events around sort of hardware or expiry dates or end of support or end of life cycle sort of things, then it's going to be equally as sort of uninspiring to the customer when that conversation pops up. It's necessary, but it won't necessarily sort of, as you've alluded to, get those heroes within the organization who get excited, start asking you as to what's the next thing I can do, how can I do this, or bringing the problems to the table as to how they can fully take advantage of their investment to maximize their return, increase their productivity, and ultimately differentiate themselves from their competitors, whatever industry that might be. I think one thing I wanted to, before I shoot over to you, sorry about that, one thing that I was sort of thinking about is how do people get to that stage? So there's obviously, you have a conversation with a customer or a partner, but there seems to be a core requirement around that discovery conversation of understanding where they are so they can then figure out what the problems are to then go forward. Is that how do you usually sort of kick that off, or where do you usually start when you're navigating that conversation with your customers?
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, clients, they don't know what they don't know. So, it always takes a little bit of education up front to kind of get that ball rolling and get them on that path. So, yeah, we run what we call a discovery workshop. So, ideally, it would be pre-migration. So, before we even talk to them about the capabilities of Office 365, you know, we're actually planning what their pathway is and what value they're going to get before they're in that space. But, I think there's a vast majority of clients that are already in Microsoft 365 now, but they're just not utilizing it. So slightly different conversation, but just around utilization and the value proposition of they already have the licenses, so you may as well start using them. So yeah, our discovery phase really it has to be quite fluid because you're walking into a client not really knowing what their pain points are. Like we have the knowledge in the tech space around what the capabilities are, what all the tool sets are. But until you're actually sat in front of the client and they're saying, Johnny's got really, you know, bad task management problems, or we have really bad issues with around communication and we're sending like thousands of email chains internally and things like that. You don't really know where the conversation is going to head. So we keep discovery as a really fluid conversation, but we tackle their day-to-day problems and then we start mapping together solutions that fit to resolve those issues. And then kind of holistically, we're then talking to the client at a completely different level around, so if, this person does this, what's the outcome for this person and how do you map those two processes together? And your understanding then of how they work as a business, that you have a completely different level of that conversation. And so that's where we really find it sets us away from being the level one help desk support, like fixing printer problems and things like that. People actually come to us saying, if we were to change this process or if we were to introduce a new staff member, how would we go about doing this? To me, that's a much more interesting conversation than, you know, the internet going offline or something along those lines. So, yeah, and I think that's where we should be heading as a tech space. I see that there's a clear division, like IT is heading down the security path, but I equally think that the productivity pathway is a massive opportunity for MSPs in the IT world. So jump on board because that's where it's heading.
Oh, awesome. And yeah, I think sort of alluding back to the Inspire announcements last week around sort of opportunities within the productivity space, there is still that there's a bit more of an even flow to that good cop, bad cop scenario around bad cop. You need to do your security to keep your compliance in check, to keep your environment safe. But now the good cop of here's all the fun solutions that you can take advantage of once you have that solid foundation. So the bit more of the push and pull, whereas I think the cybersecurity conversation's been a bit more of the push over the past couple of years, especially with those big flagship breaches and that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose the slight difference with productivity is you don't often have the trigger point. So with security, you could say to people, well, you've had a breach or some, high profile companies had a breach. You should think about it and start pushing down that pathway. So you have a trigger point there. Whereas productivity, you don't often have a trigger point. So usually for us, the trigger point is actually that migration. So you're looking to decommission their server and push their infrastructure into SharePoint or Teams or something along those lines. Um, and that's really where we start having that conversation. Like, did you know there's a better way of filing your documents, for example? And so, yeah, I think for the productivity space, it's just having that recurring like QBRs where you're just talking to people about, what's happening, who you're engaging with, what's the problems between your departments. And quite often I know in MSP space, we're having QBRs of the leadership team, but you actually need to step that down and actually talk on the floor. I know as part of our education programs, we do what we call floor walks. And so after we've done some education training, then we'll actually walk around to people's desks and talk to them about, implementing Teams in their own workspace. How would they use Teams or in their department or as an individual person? And that's where you start getting these little nuggets of information and you start piecing it together and you go, well, hang on, if you're using this form and they're using this form, and when you submit that form, then someone else has to get the response. And then you start looking at the whole business process, and then it becomes a lot clearer. But you kind of have to get into the trenches and start talking to the users about those issues. So yeah, our QBRs are actually at the next level down. Is talking to the users and getting some value for them in that utilization.
Oh, awesome. And thinking about that was actually going to be one of my questions around sort of what does a good discovery look like? Is it from that initial standpoint. So obviously getting into the end users and understanding what's working on the ground or what's not working on the ground from there. But when you're going through that discovery process, are you including the entire leadership team and end users there, or what does the kind of like that stakeholder engagement look like when it's a good one from your perspective?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we quite often get a top-down approach where clients say to us, we want the leadership team to sit here and tell you what's going to happen, and we kind of map it out. But really, you don't get the buy-in from the users at that point. So we always try and say, you need a representation of each department as a minimum in that discovery workshop, because that's really where that fluidity of Department A, how they communicate with Department B, and how we can map that together as a modern workplace in teams, as an example. So yeah, we want to have that granular interaction at that discovery workshop, 100%.
Awesome. And is there any department that usually causes more issues than not as far as winning them over on the vision?
Oh, winning them over. I was going to say the ones with the problems are usually sales, but we won't touch on that too much. So the winners are usually HR. So if a company has people and culture, then that's usually a big driving factor into that change into the organization. So they want to create resources and have a document management structure where they have control across the documents for policies and things like that. So HR, yeah, people and culture. Um, Quite often the conversations around restriction of access to information. So that usually is driven from, finance and the board. So separating that structure out. Otherwise, I suppose the other common one is if they have quality, risk, and compliance officers inside the organization. So, they're looking to implement procedures around, health and safety incidents and complaints management to resolve feedback issues and things like that. Under quality, as soon as you uncover a problem, then looking to resolve it. So that sometimes gets us involved in resolving that process as well. So that I would say that was our main trigger points here for them, was be quality, risk, and HR, and more on the security side would be around finance and obviously IT departments as well is a big one. So when we're talking to them about how we're going to implement the structure.
Well, and so say for example, we've gone through a whole bunch of digital transformation change in the sort of the COVID period up until now, where a lot of organisations were sort of rushed into sort of the digital platform away from what their traditional file setup would be or their traditional productivity stack would have been. Are you finding that when you're going in for those consultations in that discovery, you're seeing a whole bunch of like unique issues as far as how people have adapted to the modern way of working, or is there still people who are still within the sort of on-prem scenario that you would have been migrating across, or are they starting to dry up now? Are there any sort of ways that you need to sort of think about that discovery when you're tackling how to get them into that ideal state once you go through the buy-in, the implementation, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, like I said earlier, the ideal scenario is you're doing all the discovery and the planning before we start migrating people in. But like I said, most people are already there. So now what we're looking at is quite often a cleanup process, because people have deployed teams over COVID, and because they had to put in an infrastructure for remote communications and document access and things like that. So yeah, now quite often we are talking to people about what have you actually got, taking stock, and then actually how would we kind of make best use of that now to kind of progress forward. I think it's interesting when we look at what a bad deployment is, that that kind of maybe guides us towards what we should be doing for a good deployment. But some of the kind of, I guess, worst cases from my perspective are around just dumping files into a SharePoint library to get them off a server. I think even worse than that would be to then map them as a local drive back on the workstations again, because for me that has provided like zero productivity value for the client. All you've done is, from a technical perspective, taken it off the server and put it into SharePoint. But then mapping it back to the user, nothing changes. They just carry on accessing the files exactly how they would previously have accessed the files on the server. So to me, that provides like zero productivity value for them. But actually thinking through the process of building an infrastructure for their SharePoint libraries. Even if we're not doing it as a SharePoint implementation project and we're not building out a site structure with news and events and all those other things, but just thinking purely on the file structure, how would we build that out with permissions and security groups and access and read-only rights and reviewers' rights and edit rights? How would you actually build that structure out so that in the future they grow as an organization and then want to implement a SharePoint intranet, you're almost just turning it on because the structure's already there. You're not having to go and rethink the process. And when we talk about triggers, it's interesting because you only have that one opportunity for people to clean up, and that's usually at that migration stage. So you're saying to people, you have 4 weeks to clean up all of your files and prep them ready for the migration. So that's your trigger point. If you say to them, okay, well, we'll just move the files for now and you can clean them up later, it is never going to happen. Like 100%, it will never happen once they've moved it into that SharePoint space. So for us, we make sure that that has happened prior to the migration. You've got, you have their eyes on the task to make sure that that happens. And then we do the migration into a distributed library space. So, you have multiple sites, you have multiple libraries in those sites, and you're setting the permissions at the highest possible level, which for us, we prefer to do it at site level because you have a lot more visibility than doing it at a granular library or even folder or file level. So yeah, to me, that's a worst case scenario would be to dump all the files into a library and then turn on mapped drives, because that's, like I said earlier, that's how they always used to do it. So that's what people like. For us, it only takes a little bit of education, just, showing people the value, training them in how to use SharePoint online. And even if they have to turn on local syncing for particular reasons, having it online provides you so much more value. And we could talk for hours about metadata and flat document structure, but we don't have time for that, so we won't go down that path today. But yeah.
Well, I was going to say I can fully relate to the putting bad in, getting bad out scenario. I think I've still got some boxes in the shed that I was planning to file away very correctly when I moved house, but so c'est la vie, they're still sitting there. So I can take some inspiration from your approach of doing the hard work up front, knowing where to put it, so then it's more consumable later, and you actually have a more effective way of storing all your stuff. So I'll take that on board for stuff in my shed. I think you've touched on some great points as far as like once you've gone through your discovery and through that implementation stage, the organisation's sort of bought in. Thinking about those ways to future-proof that, I guess it analogizes the big shift from sort of troubleshooting or break fix sort of modeling to MSP, ongoing services, from an IT level, but also from your perspective, that future proofing sounds like it's something that requires ongoing training and ongoing sort of checking in on how people are adopting the tools and making sure that they're successful. Are there any other things that you would consider, or you'd think that a provider should consider when they are thinking about, okay, we've done the hard work up front, we've put in the right structure for this migration, everything's gone into the way that we're able to sort of get them ready and up and running now. How do you then future-proof that ongoing to make sure they get the most out of that investment, but you're also getting to engage with that customer in an ongoing basis as well?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think for me, future-proofing is having a long-term pathway lined out for the client. So they might have said, well, let's just do Teams for now. And we quite often find that small organizations, they just do Teams implementation because that gives them their documents and it gives them their conversation threads all in that one space. As they grow, or they may already have some need for a SharePoint infrastructure, we'd map that into the future plan. So we'd be tracking along and saying, well, let's do Teams, in 2023, and then we'll be looking at SharePoint in 2024 and mapping that out. So for me, I'd be always thinking in mind that today they're only asking for Teams, but tomorrow they might ask for SharePoint, or, we've already put it on the board for SharePoint in the future. So I'd be building my Teams infrastructure with the intention of it eventually becoming a SharePoint infrastructure, rather than just at the moment, this is what they're asking for, so we'll deploy the Teams. And then if they come back asking for SharePoint, then we're having to re-manipulate everything. So for me, that's the number one with future-proofing. The second is just around that long-term, the longevity utilization. So, when we roll out software like Teams and SharePoint intranets, people are really enthusiastic, and you quite often see it kind of plummeting like weeks after that. So you have really high utilization. Everyone's excited and on board with creating new content, creating news and stuff like that, and communicating in there. But it's very easy for people to slip back into that whole, well, I'll just send an email because that's what I used to do. So what we do is we train what we call champions. So these on-premise champions are usually the people that drive the projects internally. So we end up dealing with sometimes up to about 7 people in the organization. So we train them up as editors and content creators inside that space. We find like don't do 1 or 2 because if they churn out the organization, then the whole project dies. So we find 7's a nice number. Obviously, it depends on the size of the organization. If there are only 7, then you're probably not going to train 100% of the organization. But yeah, just to give us that touch point for the longevity, and we work with them. So we train them in how to edit and create the content, and then they come to us for support. And when they started rolling it out, we get their users coming to them, and so it's kind of like a filtered funnel. And then they come to us and say, hey, we've got this problem over here, and how can we look at resolving that? So again, from my perspective, user training and having that level of knowledge inside their organization is really key. Having said that, there is an element of risk to that as well. So you have like citizen developers and you have power users, and these people that go and create lots of content and essentially creating sprawl and chaos inside of that environment. Sometimes we have to kind of warn them around the best practices and how to prevent that from happening. Unfortunately, Microsoft make it very easy for people to create stuff in their space. You can create forms, you can create lists, you can create workflows, you can create apps. There's lots of things you can create, but unless you actually follow the best practice guidelines, Microsoft have made it that it's tied to the individual user that creates those resources. And we quite often receive calls from people saying, hey, our workflows have stopped working and our forms have stopped working. And that's because they were tied to a single user who, at some point left the organization. 90 days later, their recycle bin's been cleared, and they now everything stopped working, and they were critical business processes. So for us, for that future proofing, it's just making sure that you actually do things right from the start and not retrospectively trying to recover some of those key infrastructures that people have created. So that's another point I would make around future proofing. And then finally, it's we run utilization reporting for our clients. So, we show them what tools are being used, whether they're being underutilized, whether they had made a commitment to transition their internal communications from emails into Teams. But if we see that Teams utilization starts dropping, but email communication starts increasing again, then we'll offer to do some more training and bring in their staff. And then, that triggers the conversation. And then people say, oh, actually, we've had a large number of staff change in the last 3 months. And that hasn't been part of their onboarding process, is to teach them how to use Teams. So then we offer them Teams training again. And, as part of our management, we offer regular Teams training anyway. So if any of our managed clients, they could just jump onto our Teams Tuesdays and get up to speed for all their new staff, or serves as a refresher for any old staff that may have forgotten the way. And of course, there's an opportunity for us to talk about the feature releases and the new things that have been released, and some oddities that may occur in that process from Microsoft.
No, that's awesome. I think, and it kind of raises a new point, because often you don't really think about that user churn as far as the feature sets that you're going to have from that monthly user perspective. There has been a pretty much an increased sort of emphasis on the monthly active users that partners are supporting, with the changeover to the solution partners designations, where now partners are recognized and given their designations based on the amount of deployments, and then monthly active users, they grow over a 12-month period. So you've raised a great point. If partners aren't reinforcing those users, or if there's churn within an organization, and then utilization of those services drop off, they may actually see it being quite challenging to renew their designation in 12 months' time if they don't grow that monthly active user pool. So I think having that just reemphasizes that ongoing relationship and the requirement around that. I did have a question around, so like the change management piece. It seems to come up time and time again as being crucial for people to adopt new technology. Obviously, it's a change in behavior, and it's you mentioned before an example of just people going through all of the effort and all the expense of modernizing and updating and then just doing it like they've always done, which is obviously
Yeah.
not an ideal scenario when the CFO is looking at it. But for that as a skill set, it's obviously a little bit of a different skill set going through user training and assisting organizations to change there. How do you sort of tackle that from the customer 365 perspective? Was that something that you've always sort of done, or was there a period in time where you thought, okay, I need to adopt a methodology, or there's something that I need to do from my organization perspective to get that skill set so I could then increase the chance of success for my deployments and the customer success on the back of that?
Yeah, I mean, we've always had education as a big part of our business. That's usually education is the foot in the door to get us the project work really. So, quite often people say to us, let's start with Excel training. Well, that's a common one that people know that they don't know how to use Excel, so they approach us for training. That's a foot in the door, like I say, just to talk about, well, why are you even using an Excel spreadsheet? Have that conversation and then look at alternative options. But training for us has always been a big one. But our business has changed in the way that we deliver our projects. In the early days, we would try and do everything on behalf of the client. So we'd sit in a workshop and we'd design out a perfect SharePoint infrastructure, and then we'd go away and create the content and create the pages, sit in front of the client and go, is this what you wanted? And, that we used to see this is after the go live, the client was happy, we go live, and then that you get that utilization spike, and then it just dwindles off because they weren't brought into the process of actually creating the content themselves. So that's where we really changed that business model to be like, well, actually, we're not going to build it anymore. We're just going to show them how they can build it and they can maximize the value for themselves. And so really our champion training has become the core part of our business, is showing them essentially how to DIY their own SharePoint intranet. And obviously we're there for support throughout the whole journey. But really, if they build it themselves, they're more likely to have longevity and buy-in for that long term. That's how, yeah, that seems to have proven to work pretty well.
Yeah, awesome. And yeah, I guess it's a skill set that develops over time. And if you focused on it for quite a long time, that'll help sort of with your internal IP and branding and all that. So the sort of great stuff. But I think for some of the partners that may be listening to this from the MSP world, it may be a bit of a change as to how they're adopting. But I think the way that we're then communicating around things like security adoption, and there's obviously user awareness training and ongoing training component to that. They can think about that in a similar way to how they're tackling the productivity advancements of their partners as well. So yeah, good food for thought for them. Yeah, so we kind of covered off the sort of how you go through the discovery process, how you then future-proof that migration once you've gone through the discovery and it's been implemented and all that sort of stuff. But you've mentioned a few processes, like mentioning often it's the HR department or some of those other similar departments that see the most of the value. It sounds like there's a lot of repeatable processes in there that are able to be sort of built upon so that they can do it more efficiently. We've spoken largely within sort of SharePoint teams and that sort of stuff, and those sort of more file-based servers. But I understand that you work quite a lot within the Power Platform stack and Power Automate in order to build IP on top to help with the recurring processes and speed up the productivity gains in that area. Are you able to sort of talk through how you approach that? Because I know a lot of the partners I speak to really the ears prick up when they hear Power Automate or Power Platform, but they don't really know where to start. But so hearing about some of the actual case studies or use cases that you can provide for maybe great if you're able to sort of speak about those a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the Power Platform is my space. I love working in Power Automate, for example. But you're absolutely right. So I think the biggest opportunity for any MSP is actually that Power Platform space. But you have to have the fundamentals. So that's why talking about teams of SharePoint is those fundamentals, creating that workspace and then building on it. Once you understand how a business works, start looking at their requirements for any applications or any workflow or automation and integration. And so that's where we start migrating into that Power Platform space. So for those that don't know, I know you said that most MSPs, their ears prick up when you start talking about it, but for those that don't know, so the Power Platform is a collection of tools inside of Microsoft Office 365 You have Power Apps for app development, so actually creating mobile apps or web app interfaces that have, I mean, you can have any backend infrastructure, but it's quite easy to spin it up using the Sharepoint list structure or Dataverse structure. So yeah, Power Apps for app development. Power Automate is the tool that integrates. If you know what Zapier is, it's a bit similar to Zapier, but it integrates thousands of solutions together. But it back ends off Power Apps as well. So you can have an app interface that uses Power Automate to pull information from many resources and present them into an app, or to trigger, and it's all based on triggers and actions. So you can have events that trigger and then follow through with an action. So I'm trying to think some examples of Power Automate that are pretty cool around document workflow automation. So we've got a solution around document management. So having a library in SharePoint that has review cycles. So if you imagine you put your policies in there or your procedure manuals, and then you set up review cycles. So that's managed by Power Automate to send out reminders to the document owners to say that this document is due for its review. And then we're building out a task list for those owners to then review those documents. They close their task, publish the documents, and then we have a task list for people to read and acknowledge those documents. So let's say I'm the HR guy and I write my policy and I share them with you, the staff member. You'll have a read-only version of the document, but you have a task to close to say that you have read and understood that document. Then in 12 months' time, I'll get a review to re-review it. If it's okay when I make no changes, I just republish it again for another 12 months. If there's some changes that, things have changed in acts and things like that, so I change my policy, and then I republish it. You as a staff member will get another task to read those changes in those documents. So that's all powered from inside Power Automate. And we have a Power App that manages the creation of those documents, so categorizing the documents through the metadata steps that you would for creating a managed document. So that's one example. We've done some really cool things around using AI resources to read and review documents. We've had invoices process is a pretty simple one where we hook into an accounts mailbox. So we're reading the accounts at client's domain mailbox, and every time an invoice hits that, we're grabbing the invoice. The robot reads the invoice and extracts out invoice numbers, purchase order numbers, dollar amounts, payment dates, and things like that. And then we could kick off an approval process. So we're then sending, based on the purchase order, who the manager is that needs to approve the invoice. And it goes through this whole workflow through management, and then you might even go through the warehouse to make sure that the stock was received to match the invoice. We can build in things like, if the invoice matches the purchase order dollar value, then you auto approve it because someone's already approved the purchase order. But otherwise, if there's discrepancies, then you could kick off a change approval request. And then so you can escalate from dispatch to management to finance ready for the payment. And so that's a really cool workflow that you can build. Another one was in a medical practice. We had doctors that were writing handwritten notes, but they wanted to upload those and store them on a local file server. But we actually used Power Automate they would scan the appointment slip and attach it to the handwritten notes. Our robot would read the appointment slip and then file based on knowing now who the doctor was and who the patient was by the NHI number and the date of the appointment. We could then file the handwritten notes into a library or an on-premise resource. So there's some really cool opportunities around Power Automate. I love that space. I probably spent about 7 hours of my day in Power Automate. But then there's Power BI as well. So Power BI, many of you may already know, but it's a data reporting and analytics. So you could build dashboards and KPI metrics and all sorts of things like that. So that falls under the Power Platform space as well. And there's other things like Power Virtual Agents, which are chatbots that you can build, and you can integrate those into Teams so the staff can ask questions of the chatbot, and you integrate that with Power Automate to go and find external resources and pull that back in and continue that chat thread inside of Teams, for example. There's Power Automate for the desktop, which is for automating legacy applications. So that's automating like a point and click with the mouse movement. So whereas Power Automate for the cloud is to say, you using API interface to actually change data in a different application. With Power Automate Desktop, you can actually say in this legacy app, you want to click, that field there, type in an ID, you want to click that field there and update the client's contact details, and then you click the save button. And so Power Automate for Desktop is really great for those opportunities where they haven't yet migrated into a cloud service. So that's a really cool opportunity as well. There's other things we could talk about. Dataverse is a big one. Dataverse is the database that backs Dynamics, but you can actually interface that into Teams, and you could create solutions in Teams that uses the Dataverse infrastructure. But generally speaking, for 90% of our projects, we just talk to clients about SharePoint lists and building apps on SharePoint lists, because that usually is enough security for what they need, and they're not super complicated when you actually boil down what a business process is for someone. But I think actually the biggest opportunity is the fact that in a Power Platform, you can create solution sets. So where a client may come to us with what they think is quite unique a problem to resolve, quite often it's not. And 80% of the solution we've already got mapped out. And if you think of, we have a health and safety app that manages the incidents around health and safety events or hazards inside the organization. We had another client come to us saying, well, we want to do a complaints management process. So when we get complaints, if you actually map those two processes, they're exactly the same. So someone's logging an incident or they're logging a complaint. You have an incident health and safety officer that reviews them and then comes up with a resolution plan. The same with the complaints. You have a customer services manager usually that comes up with a resolution plan. And then you have an escalation process on both of them. And then you have a reminder process to make sure that they're being dealt with within a timely fashion for both of them. So when you actually boil it down, they're essentially the same solution, but provide very different functions within the organization. So quite often now we have base templates for most of the work that we do for delivering it. And we try and work on the 80-20 rule. So if we deploy the solution that provides 80% of the value, and then we can wiggle the last 20% to fit what the client needs. And, we've been doing this for 5 years now, so we have quite a solution stack. But that's the beauty of Power Platform, is you could build these solutions and then you can deploy them across any of your client tenants. So that's how we do that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think it was basically answered already some of the questions I was going to ask around the custom dev side of things versus how much you've already got sort of pre-built and then adapt from there. So that 80-20 rule sounds like a really, it's the number that we always see pop up in pretty much every part of commercial life, of the 80-20 sort of side of things. So sounds like a great approach to be able to have that adaptability so that your clients will have a solution that's specific to them, but making sure that you can scale so that you're able to have economies at scale. So making sure the time that you're investing in that client is going to be commercially sound and that sort of thing. Going back to sort of the common thing I hear from MSPs is they're always looking for ways to differentiate. And then that's why their ears sort of prick up when they hear about the Power Platform, but then it is that starting point. But I think you've mentioned a few really great live examples of, if they do have an industry focus, they can think about what are those common processes to build around that, or work with a partner like yourself who's already done the hard work to get the ball rolling and bring you into that conversation. I really like the power of AI in that story. If it's able to read doctors' handwriting and then turn that into text from there, it's doing something right. But no, that's great. I think tying the whole universe together, it's from all the way from Power Apps through to Power Automate through to Power BI. There's obviously a bit of investment and quite a skill set that come into that. If you're thinking about a partner who either partnering with yourself, or if they're thinking to build that sort of practice in-house, have you seen, do people need to have like at least one dedicated resource to this, or do they need to have a team? Like what's the sort of scalability or the skill set required to sort of tackle this exciting side of the stack?
Yeah, that's right. When I talk to most of the MSPs that we partner with, they have considered building in-house resources for themselves. But when you take into account that, you may have one person that's capable in the organization of looking to build out some of these solutions for clients, then it becomes, what happens if they leave? What happens if that person's away when the support ticket comes in? You have to have overlap in the organization. So you have to have multiple resources that can manage that process. But not only that, if you start having the conversation around app development and customization of workflows, it's not actually just that one resource that needs to know. Your entire frontline help desk needs to know, because the client's going to phone and they're going to expect everyone to be able to help them because that's what you offered. So for us, we find that the separation between the MSP and us as a value added provider that can support the MSP is really helpful. However, there's no reason why an MSP couldn't get that infrastructure set up for themselves. But yeah, it's just balancing out whether you can effectively build that resource and have enough demand on your client base to warrant building a team and some resources around it.
Yeah, and if you have the pipeline to then sort of, or the length that it's going to take to close that pipeline to justify the investment in the internal headcount or in that internal practice to be built, which is the constant sort of seesawing between partner to partner plays, or trying to build that practice internally. And often the partner to partner, if you can find a partner that you work well alongside with, that seems to be the one that that usually wins out in that case. From that perspective, because I think we've covered off most of the bases of what I wanted to sort of cover off today. And as you said, we could talk on for hours and hours about this stuff, especially the areas that you're really passionate about. But if a partner does want to reach out, or someone wants to reach out to get in touch with you and have a bit of a conversation, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Ian, and it's just ian@custom365.co. So to reach out via email or find me on LinkedIn. Any of those avenues. The website is custom365.co, just like my email, so pretty straightforward. I'm more than happy to jump on a call with anyone or grab a coffee if you are local. I am Auckland based, but by all means, yeah, book a time slot and we can jump on a Teams call, something like that.
Awesome. And yeah, feel free to, if you want me to put you in touch with Ian, feel free to reach out to myself. You'll have my details when I chuck this up on LinkedIn and on our YouTube channel as well. Yeah, no, Ian, thanks very much. It's been great to dive into your side of the world a bit more, especially getting my brain outside of the Inspire stuff for a couple of hours is always nice as we continue to kind of put that together. So for anyone who's made it through this far, thanks very much for listening. But we will be providing some more recaps and guidance on a lot of the new Inspire announcements, and then also how we can start taking more advantage of the stuff that's coming more across your side of the town, and the Power Automate stuff and the exciting developments there too.
Yeah, look forward to it. Yeah, happy to jump on again.
No, perfect. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, you have a great day, and I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.